Well, welcome back to Session 4 of Refuge, Finding Home in a World of Change. You know, we really were in the middle of the story when we ended Session 3. Ruth has gone to glean, to pick up the leftovers that the harvesters have missed. And we find out that of all the fields she could have picked, she just so happened to choose the field of Boaz. She doesn't know who he is. The scriptures just mentioned his name earlier, but didn't develop any of that. And so she knows about the same amount as we know in this story. And they've had a conversation. The overseer, the supervisor, has described Ruth and said she's a Moabite. She came here with her mother-in-law Naomi from Moab. But he doesn't stop there just with the label. He explains her character. She's polite. She asks for permission. There's no hint of entitlement to her in her request. And she's a hard worker. She's worked steadily from morning, just one quick break. And so that's the background that we have, and there's really no break between last session and this one. We just needed to split it up because the content is so rich, we wanted to slow it down some. We pick up the story in verse 14 of Ruth 2. It says, "At mealtime, Boaz said to her, 'Come over here, have some bread and dip it in the wine vinegar.' And when she sat down with the harvesters, he offered her some roasted grain. She ate all she wanted and had some left over. As she got up to glean, Boaz gave orders to his men, 'Let her gather among the sheaves and don't reprimand her. Even pull out some stalks for her from the bundles and leave them for her to pick up. And don't rebuke her.' So Ruth gleaned in the field until evening. Then she threshed the barley she had gathered, and it amounted to about an ephah." This is just, so much of this is unprecedented. You know, he says, not only allow her to glean, don't hassle her, don't rebuke her, but in fact, some of what you as harvesters have picked up, some of the stalks of grain, pull a few of those out and just happen to drop them. Leave her a little extra. This is just an unprecedented level of generosity. In fact, after she finishes her gleaning and she's threshed it all out, we're told that it's about an ephah. Well, what's an ephah? You know, when I looked at it, I was shocked. It's about 23 liters, or if you convert that to the imperial system, that's about 6 gallons of grain. Amazing. By offering Ruth extravagant generosity, Boaz does so much more than the law requires. Remember last time we talked about the law said, don't go through your field a second time. Don't be greedy. If some grapes fall off in your vineyards, don't pick them up. Don't yell at your workers and say, why are you wasting money? Leave that there. Leave that there for the poor. I met a man one time. I was teaching on the book of Ruth, and he came up and he said, I hate this book and I love this book. And I said, sounds like you have a story you need to tell me. And he says, yeah. He says, I operate a series of grocery stores. It's not a big national franchise. It's just a small chain locally. And he said, we would catch homeless people going through the dumpsters behind our stores. And this was brought to my attention, and my first response was, then put locks on each of those dumpsters. I am not going to have people taking food for free because then they won't buy it for us. And soon word will spread, and there'll be more people outside the store in the back alley than are inside the store. And I just smiled because I knew where this was going. And he said, I was reading through the Bible that year, and when I got to the book of Ruth, when I read the passages that you had talked about earlier from Judges, it's like God just reached down and he grabbed my heart and said, that is exactly what you're doing. You're trying to squeeze every dollar, every penny out of your business. And all that food is going to waste because of your greed, and people are starving because of it. What a tangible, specific application to this principle in the book of Ruth. Let's keep going in verse 18. She carried it back to town, and her mother-in-law saw how much she had gathered. Ruth also brought out and gave her what she had left over when she had eaten enough. Her mother-in-law was shocked Where did all this come from? This is amazing. You've been so successful. You are good at this gleaning stuff. Verse 19, her mother-in-law asked her, where did you glean today? Where did you work? Blessed be the man who took notice of you. Then Ruth told her mother-in-law that the one at whose place she had been working, the name of the man I worked with today is Boaz, she said. And suddenly, everything makes sense. Remember chapter 2, verse 1, where Boaz's name is just dropped by the writer, but then not developed? We find out that Boaz is very important, very central to the story. Of all the fields Ruth could have chosen to glean in, God clearly led her to Boaz's field, and God brought him there on that precise day. God is not only feeding these two women, He is rekindling Naomi's hope and drawing Ruth to Himself. Let's keep going because this gets even better. Verse 20, the Lord bless him, Naomi said to her daughter-in-law. He has not stopped showing His kindness. Remember that word? It's the Hebrew word hesed. His kindness, His commitment, His loyal love. He has not stopped showing His kindness to the living and the dead. She added, that man is our close relative. He is one of our guardian redeemers. I don't know about you, but I go weeks without using the term guardian redeemer. Or some of your translations say kinsman redeemer. I don't say that very often either. Boaz is identified as a guardian redeemer, but what is that? What does that mean? Deuteronomy, again, provides the background. Deuteronomy 25, starting in verse 5, says, if brothers are living together and one of them dies without a son, his widow must not marry outside the family. Her husband's brother shall take her and marry her and fulfill the duty of a brother-in-law to her. The first son she bears shall carry on the name of the dead brother, so that his name will not be blotted out from Israel. Over in your Step into the Story column, as prescribed in Israelite family law, a guardian redeemer acts sacrificially to preserve the family land and perpetuate the family line. You know, to us this seems so strange, doesn't it? I know Ellen, when I was working on this, I have an older brother, and she was like, oh, that's just weird. That's maybe even kind of gross. But you know what? This system, you got to look at it through the original context of when it occurred. Back in history, this system worked very well for centuries. In Old Testament times, it was the family rather than the government that took primary responsibility to care for widows and orphans. So what to us seems very strange and even a little bit weird, it was actually a brilliant system for caring for the needs of widows and orphans. You know, as we teach all around the world with Walk Through the Bible, we have ministry in about 130 countries. There are some parts of the world, there are parts of Africa today where they'll go, wow, this would be so much better. If a woman's husband dies, there's parts of Africa where she doesn't even inherit his land. His brothers take the land. She's suddenly homeless. She's penniless. Sometimes she doesn't even have rights to keep her own children. And so this system, though it seems strange to us, there was actually so much compassion and wisdom built into it. Verse 21, then Ruth the Moabite said, he even said to me, stay with my workers until they finish harvesting all my grain. Naomi said to Ruth, her daughter-in-law, it will be good for you, my daughter, to go with the women who work for him, because in someone else's field, you might be harmed. Again, we see how vulnerable a woman, especially a foreign woman, was to violence, sexual abuse, harassment. It's a sad commentary on the spiritual values of God's own people during the dark days of the Judges. You know, by contrast to all that, it's easy to see why Boaz was so well respected as a man of integrity and generosity. Verse 23, Ruth does exactly as Naomi has instructed her, as Boaz has invited her, says, so Ruth stayed close to the women of Boaz, to glean until the barley and wheat harvests were finished, and she lived with her mother-in-law. It's so cool in the book of Ruth. Every chapter ends with a bit of a cliffhanger. Now that harvest is over, it's been great. I didn't have to go to a different field every day. Boaz said, just come here and stay. But now that the harvest is over, there will be no more gleaning. Now how will God provide for the needs of Ruth and Naomi? We'll have to find out in our next session. But the story of Ruth, this is so important to look at it this way, the story of Ruth teaches more than the customs of the culture. It reveals the heart of God. It's not just going, oh, they had a practice called gleaning, or they had this kind of strange system for perpetuating the name of the family and keeping the land in the family, all of that. That's fascinating, and we've got to understand that. But more than that, it's looking beyond trying to understand the customs of the day and really trying to grasp what is God's heart like. This is the lens through which we really should read all the stories of the Bible. Not merely as history so we'll know what happened back then. Not just so if we are on Jeopardy and the final question is a Bible question. I have nightmares about what if I get on Jeopardy and blow a Bible question. I'd bet everything when I saw the category. Then my kids would be laughing at me, but I'm probably unemployed when I get back to Atlanta. Anyway, that's not why we study the Bible. It's not so we know what happened back then, but so we'll really see the heart of God, not just history, but windows into His character. The book of Ruth teaches us the heart of God. It shows us that God provides for His people, especially those who need it most, the widows, the orphans. And He's not just limited in His concern to people from the nation of Israel. His heart is big enough for the needs of all people. And that's why He is worthy of our trust too. It's easy to forget that you and I were, or perhaps still are, foreigners or aliens or strangers to God because of our sin. Like Naomi and Ruth, we desperately need a Redeemer. That's exactly the Apostle Paul's point in Ephesians chapter 2. There in verse 12 he writes, remember that at that time you were separate from Christ, excluded from the citizenship in Israel, and foreigners to the covenants of the promise, without hope and without God in the world. But now in Christ Jesus, you who were once far away have been brought near by the blood of Christ. Through Christ's sacrifice, who is our guardian redeemer, we can come home as members of God's family. A few verses later, in verse 19, we read, consequently, you are no longer foreigners and strangers, but fellow citizens with God's people, and also members of His household, built on the foundation of the apostles and prophets, with Christ Jesus Himself as the chief cornerstone. We don't get a chance to be any more of an insider than that. Even if we're just brand new to this Christianity thing, we're tied to the message of the prophets. We're in the line of the apostles in the New Testament. Why? Because we're related to Jesus Himself. He is our guardian redeemer. If we've been grafted into God's family, then what? Well, then our calling is to guide others into that same relationship that we now enjoy. Step into the story you see over there in that column. It's often said evangelism is just one beggar telling another beggar where to find food. I love that quote. Evangelism is just one beggar telling another beggar where to find food. Maybe it's also, and this is a part I added, maybe it's also one refugee telling another refugee where to find home. Or one orphan telling another orphan where to find family. As you discuss in your group tonight, there's a lot of heart in this session. There's a lot of, maybe you had a dramatic conversion and you're being born into God's family. It was a tough labor and delivery. Or maybe you're third or fourth generation and you can't remember a time when you didn't know who Jesus was. Either way, you've got a rich story of faith that needs to be shared with your group. Share that story of when and how God moved you from outsider to insider, from foreigner to family member. If you don't have a story to share, then maybe, just maybe, that's why you're watching this teaching right now. Because this opportunity still exists. The door is still open. God is still available. Jesus Christ wants to become your guardian redeemer. And that's His invitation to you and to all of us. So share in your groups and open up. It's your story intersecting with God's story. It's a beautiful thing, whether that happened decades ago or whether He's stirring that in your spirit right now. Go for it.